Hi everyone, welcome to our How to Ace the SAT and ACT Edivisa panel. This is our second workshop in our college admission series for the 2022 to 2023 admission cycle. So I just want to start off by just going over what we're going to be covering today. We're going to start off with an introduction, which is what I'm doing right now. Then I'm going to go over a quick overview of the SAT and ACT, including the structure of these exams, as well as the scoring. Then I'm going to ask a couple of questions to our panelists, which includes asking about specific strategies for the individual sections of the SAT, as well as overall academic journey advice. Finally, we'll end it off with audience Q&A. So first, I'll just introduce who our panelists are who are joining us today. So we are joined by four great panelists, Mihael, Trisha, Jenny, and Anish. So Mihael is a rising freshman at Duke University. He is planning on majoring in biomedical engineering as well as minoring in math and French. In high school, he was involved in math and science competitions, robotics, quiz bowl, ultimate frisbee, and chess. He scored a 1560 on his SAT with perfect scores in the math and writing sections. He also received a perfect 36 on the ACT with perfect scores in math, science, and writing. He's always enjoyed teaching and tutoring since he loves sharing his gifts with others. Next, we're joined by Trisha, who is an incoming freshman at NYU majoring in biology. She is a huge science nerd and another ultimate frisbee player, and she loves to teach, which is why she joined Edivisa. She scored a 1550 on her SAT with perfect scores in the writing and math sections. We're also joined by Jenny, who is a rising high school senior who loves doing business-related activities. Over the past few years, she's been a part of student council, she's been a part of a junior achievement company, and she's the current CEO of Edivisa. She scored a 1500 super score on her SAT with a perfect score in the SAT math section. And then finally, we are joined by Anish. He is a current rising college freshman and a prospective computer science major for FIU and Georgia Tech. Throughout high school, he was involved with research, internships, science bowl, science olympiad, robotics, and web development. He scored a 35 on the SAT math section as well as a 33 on the ACT science section. So now that we've gone over the introduction, let's start off by doing a quick overview of the SAT and ACT. Let's start off by talking about which factors are the most important in college admissions. This is just to help us gain a bigger picture of where standardized testing falls. So the most important factors for college admissions will be your GPA, your academic performance, and your standardized test scores. This is followed by your extracurricular activities, followed by your essays that you write in your application, including your personal statement and supplemental essays, followed by letters of recommendations from your teachers and employers, and then other factors such as demonstrated interest, portfolio, interviews, etc. Today we'll be focusing particularly on standardized test scores. I do want to mention though that a large number of schools are growing to become test optional. This has especially risen after the COVID pandemic, since schools are starting to recognize that the SAT and ACT may not be the most ideal indicator of academic performance, and there are many other factors that influence performance on these standardized test scores. That being said, they do still have a large weight in college admissions, which is what we're here to discuss today. So let's start by just introducing the SAT and ACT. Both of these are standardized exams and are a major component of the U.S. college admissions process. The purpose of the SAT and ACT is to measure what students have learned throughout high school, as well as to predict a student's future academic performance throughout college. Since these are standardized test exams, they are specifically designed to be similar throughout multiple admission cycles. That means that an SAT that you take in March 2020 will still have similar questions and similar designs as an SAT taken in August 2023. The SAT is particularly administered by the College Board. It stands for the Scholastic Assessment Test and is offered several times throughout the year, in March, May, June, August, October, November, and December. The SAT is composed of 4 sections in reading, writing, and math. The SAT used to have an essay section, but that is no longer administered. The SAT is also introducing a virtual format. The ACT stands for the American College Testing and is administered by the ACT Incorporation. The ACT is also offered several times throughout the year in February, April, June, July, September, October, and December. It is composed of 4 sections in writing, math, reading, and science. The ACT also includes an optional essay section. So you'll notice that, unlike the SAT, the ACT has 2 unique sections, the science section and the optional essay section. So let's talk about the SAT and ACT structure and how they compare. The SAT is designed to be slightly longer in length and also gives students more times per question. Meanwhile, the ACT has shorter times per question and is therefore shorter in length. Both exams have a reading section, a math section, and a writing and language or grammar section. However, the ACT has 2 additional unique sections, the science section and the essay section. You'll notice that the timing is very different. For example, on the SAT, a student would have roughly 75 seconds per question for reading. Meanwhile, on the ACT, students would only have 52 seconds per question. Similarly, in writing and language, on the SAT, students would have roughly 47 seconds per question. But on the ACT, students have only 36 seconds per question. So you can see how there is a significant difference in terms of pacing, which means that if you prefer a soft-paced environment for your exams, the SAT may be more ideal. But if you prefer fast-paced exams, then the ACT may be ideal. Now let's dive deeper into the structures of the SAT and the ACT. First, with the SAT. As mentioned before, the SAT has 4 different sections: reading, writing and language, math without calculator, and math with calculator. First, you'll have the reading section, 65 minutes to answer 52 questions, which includes 5 passages of roughly 10 to 11 questions each. Then this is followed by a 10-minute break. You'll then have the writing and language section, which is 35 minutes to answer 44 questions divided across 4 passages with 11 questions each. Then you'll have the math without calculator section, a math section where you're not allowed to use your calculator. You'll have 25 minutes to answer 20 questions, which includes 15 multiple choice questions and 5 grid-in questions. Grid-in questions are ones where you're not provided the multiple choice answers beforehand, and you instead have to come up with an answer on your own and bubble in your answer accordingly. After these 2 sections, you'll have an additional 5-minute break, and then you'll end with a math with calculator section, where you are permitted to use your calculator, and you'll have 55 minutes to answer 38 questions, including 30 multiple choice questions and 8 grid-in questions. For the 2 math sections, the questions will increase in difficulty, although it is not linearly, which means that although there may be a few questions later on in the section that may be easier for you, generally speaking, the questions will become harder as you go. Meanwhile, for the ACT also has 4 required sections and 1 additional optional essay section. First, you'll start off with the English section, which is the ACT's comparison to the SAT's writing and language section. In the ACT's English section, you'll have 45 minutes to answer 75 questions, divided across 5 passages with 15 questions each. Next, you'll have the math section, 60 minutes to answer 60 questions, giving you 1 minute per question. Unlike the SAT, this math section is completely multiple choice. Following the English and the math section, you'll have a 10-minute break. You'll then have your 2 reading and science sections. Both the reading and science sections are 35 minutes each with 40 questions. The reading section has 4 passages of 10 questions each, and the science section has 6 to 7 passages with roughly 6 to 8 questions per passage. After this, you'll have a 5-minute break, and you'll then have an optional essay writing section, where if you choose to take it, you'll have 40 minutes to answer 1 essay. Now that we've gone over a structure of the SAT and ACT, let's talk about grading. Both the SAT and ACT are graded on a scaled basis. That means that your scores are graded such that your final score isn't solely based off of the number of questions you got right or wrong, but it's also based on the general performance of all other students taking that particular administration. This helps to ensure that a score for a person taking an August administration is comparable to someone who took a March administration, accounting for difficulty. Since the scores are scaled, the majority of students will fall for the SAT within the 1050 to 1200 range. Similarly, for the ACT, the majority of students fall between the 15 to 26 range. The top percentile of students would fall above a 1200, and the top percentile of students would also fall above a 26. In terms of how specifically your SAT is scored, first, your reading and writing and language sections are combined to give you an evidence-based reading and writing score. Meanwhile, your two math sections, math with calculator and math without calculator, are combined to give you a math section score. Both the EBRW and math sections are scaled on a range of 200 to 800 each. These two scores are then combined to give you your total SAT composite score of 400 to 1600. This composite score can be superscored. What this means is that, let's say you decide to take your SAT 2 times officially. On your first SAT, you get a 600 EBRW score and a 500 math score. Then you retake the SAT and you get a 500 EBRW but a 700 math score. What the SAT will do, if you choose to superscore, is take the highest EBRW score that you ever received along with the highest math score that you've ever received. So that would mean that you would take your 600 from your first EBRW section and your 700 from your second math section to combine to give you your score of 1300 superscored. Additionally, the SAT provides scores in sections that are called cross-test. That includes analysis in history and analysis in social science. The SAT doesn't have particular sections dedicated to history and social science, but it does have questions throughout the different sections that cover these topics. So these scores are based off of those particular questions spread throughout the test, especially in the reading and writing and language section, to give you anyone reviewing your SAT an idea of how you do in answering questions particular to these topics. There are many other subsection scores as well that assess your ability to do particular skills in each of these different sections. Similarly for the ACT, you will first have a scaled score for each of the 4 different sections. So you will receive a score on a range of 1 to 36 on the English section, the math section, the reading section, and the science section. Then all of these scores are combined and then averaged out to give you your composite score, rounding up. So your English, your math, your reading, and science score are combined and averaged out to give you your final score on a range of 1 to 36. Similar to the SAT, this can be superscored, meaning that you can combine a higher administration from previous tests to get your final superscored score. Additionally, there's a writing score on a range of 2 to 12. If you choose to take the essay section, your score will not be factored into your composite score, but it will be shown separately. The ACT also includes scores for measures such as STEM and ELA. Your STEM score is the average of your math and science sections. Your ELA score is the average of your reading, English, and writing sections. And like the SAT, the ACT also includes scores for a breakdown of other skills as well. So now that we've talked about scores and how your test is graded, a common question that's asked is, what score should I aim to receive? The ideal score that you want to strive for is going to be dependent on the colleges you're applying to. While this isn't the best answer that you may be looking for, the reality is that different schools are looking for different scores. What may suffice as a highly competitive score in a less competitive school may put you in the bottom percentile of students for a much more competitive school. This is why it's imperative for you to create a college list and then do your research about what scores students who are admitted to each of the schools on your list receive, so that you can get a better understanding of what score you should aim for. In order to do this, I strongly encourage you to use the common data set. So you want your test scores to ideally be in the 75th percentile of enrolled freshmen in whichever colleges you're applying to. So what you can do is Google common data set plus the name of each school on your list. For example, you could do common data set ASU, or common data set Princeton, or common data set Boston College. Then you'll want to look for the most recent PDF file of the common data set on the school's webpage. This will usually be the first or second search result. Then, under the freshman profile of the common data set, you will find the 25th and 75th percentile scores of the SAT and ACT. You'll also be able to see lots of other valuable information in the common data set, and all colleges are required to have this on their website. For example, let's compare the common data set results of University of Washington and Harvard University. First, looking at UWs. For the SAT evidence-based reading and writing section, the bottom 25% of students who were admitted into University of Washington scored a 1590. Meanwhile, the top 25% of students who were admitted into the University of Washington scored a 700 or higher. Comparing that to Harvard, the bottom 25% of students who were admitted to Harvard scored a 720 on the SAT evidence-based reading and writing section. Meanwhile, the top 25% of students admitted to Harvard scored a 780 or higher. What this shows you is that a score of 700 makes you extremely competitive for UWs, putting you at the top 25% of admitted freshmen. However, that same score of 700 would put you at the bottom 25% of students admitted into Harvard, making you less competitive. This just drives home the point that the ideal score will vary based off of the competitiveness and the profile of the schools that you're applying to. This is why you should do your research to see what score would suffice as an ideal and realistic ballpark score for you to strive for whichever schools you're applying to. Now that we've covered an overview of the SAT and ACT, let's move on to talking about section-specific strategies. We will go over strategies for the science, reading, writing, and math sections. Just to preface this, the majority of the advice I will share for reading, writing, and math are applicable for both the SAT and ACT. There are going to be nuanced differences between the number of passages, the number of questions, the formulas provided, etc., and we will try to cover that. However, generally speaking, the advice that we share will be applicable for both tests. So, we're going to start off with the science section. Unfortunately, due to emergencies, Anish wasn't able to make it to the panel, but he did still share lots of valuable information that I'll be sharing out loud for the science section. The science section is ACT only, so it is going to be a little unique. So we're going to start off by just talking about an overview of what the ACT science section includes. The science section of the ACT involves a basic understanding of concepts covered in high school biology, physics, chemistry, and earth science classes. However, you don't need to come into the ACT science section with prior knowledge of biology, physics, chem, and earth science. You just need to be familiar with how to read science passages and how to extract information from scientific material. The questions are testing your understanding of written passages as well as visual information in the forms of graphs, infographics, and charts. You need to combine your understanding of scientific terms and concepts along with your reading comprehension of scientific material in order to successfully answer the questions. Let's talk about how your ACT science section is scored. There are three main components of the ACT science section. Interpretation of data takes 45 to 55%, a huge chunk of your score. This subscore tells how well you can understand different forms of data presented in the forms of graphs, tables, and diagrams, and how well you can use that to reason and extract inferences. This is why it is imperative for you to really take your time to break down any graphs or infographics that you come across, looking for things such as labels, trends, axes, and taking notes of what the graphs are conveying to you, since they make up such a large component of your score. Next is scientific investigation, 20 to 30%. From procedures to schools to tools, you need to be able to use given experimental results to reason and create other things, such as modifications and additional trials. This means that you need to be able to draw from procedures, methods of scientific experiments, and then consider ways to add, modify, or expand on the findings of these experiments. Then there's evaluation of models, inferences, and experimental results, which is roughly 25 to 35%. Whatever the data or the source, you will need to determine how valid the stated results are. So you need to be able to think critically about experimental design to assess if the method of the research accurately can help us gain a better understanding of the intended research question. The ACT science section involves 3 passage types: data representation, research summaries, and conflicting viewpoints. Like the other sections in the ACT, there is no penalty for incorrect responses, so answer every question, even if you're unsure of the answer. Now let's talk about particular strategies for ACT science. So we're going to first remind you to know commonly used terms. This includes the independent variable, dependent variable, constants, etc. Be familiar with the scientific method and terms frequently used in discussing scientific experiments. Next, you want to familiarize yourself with all the different passage types on the ACT science section. The main ones are research summary. You'll receive 3 of this type, which involves presenting a series of experiments. Then there's going to be data representation, 2 of this type, which presents information about a topic. And then there's going to be conflicting viewpoints. This is similar to the paired passages that you'll see on the SAT reading section, where you'll receive 2 different opinions on one particular topic. This can be 2 different theories on a particular topic. It can also be 2 different theories that agree with each other but have slightly different nuances, but share one particular topic of interest. Then, you want to make sure that you find a strategy that works for each individual passage type. So you want to practice these different passage types individually and come up with a strategy that works for the individual types. You also want to make sure you're practicing these strategies and also practicing timing. You always want to make sure you're referring to the passage for details. Even if you think you remember what the passage says, make sure you look back and check to confirm that you didn't misinterpret any details, since every word counts and all of the information is in the passage. If you're stumped on a particular question, move on. The ACT science section is very fast-paced and you simply don't have time to dwell on a question. Skip it, come back to it if you have time afterwards. And then finally, make sure that you practice key skills, such as how to read and analyze graphs to extract findings, how to analyze information presented in passages, and how to interpret and critically analyze research findings. So now I'm going to open it up to our panelists to talk about section-specific strategies for the reading, writing, and math sections. So I'll hand it over to Jenny to talk about the reading section.
So hi everyone, I am Jenny. I got a 1500 on the SAT, as Trisha already mentioned. I got a 700 on the reading section and an 800 on the math section. And I'm just going to go over my SAT journey with reading for now. If you guys have any questions for me, feel free to ask in the event questions channel. But yeah. So the first practice test I ever took was practice test 10 on Khan Academy, and this was very late, like end of grade 10, and I got a 500 on the reading section. So I ended up doing 2 Khan Academy reading passages every single day for about a month until I finished every single one, and that ended up raising my reading score to about a 550 to around 600. And after that, I ended up using the Erica Meltzer, I believe, 4th or 5th edition book. I'm not entirely sure right now. And I just used all her notes and drilled it in. So I would only print off an SAT reading section, and in 65 minutes, I would just try my best to like underline, skim, and just use all her strategies. And that improved my score a little bit, maybe like 30 points. It wasn't actually very helpful. And I found that was because I was actually using her book wrong. So I'm gonna go a bit into my strategies now. I had to go on Prep Scholar to kind of help me find a way to utilize her strategies better. And so what I found really helped me was you really have to find your reading strategy. So for some people, this could be skimming. For some people, it could be annotating. It could be like reading the questions before going to the passage, or just like taking like a full 4 minutes to read the passage and then going on to the questions and just answering them all at once. But whatever it is, you have to like practice on like three or so passages on what strategy works really well for you. And when you're trying out these reading strategies, you don't time yourself. Just try them and see how many questions you get right. It's okay if it takes you like 15 minutes per passage, because with practice, you can probably reduce that 15 minutes to around 12 minutes. And a reading strategy I would personally recommend would definitely be skimming slash annotating. I found that my reading comprehension wasn't actually that good, and I felt that annotating, so just basically writing a 5 word summary of each paragraph, really helped me go back into the passage. It just helped me stay really organized, because before I was really paranoid with my answers. There were a lot of times where I was just constantly double checking because I always felt that it was wrong for some reason. And so I'd go into the passage, I'd spend like 90 seconds on a question for no reason. And it just took a really long time searching for those answers. So annotating is just like, it was kind of adding a glossary for me, and I could find the paragraphs really easily, find the summaries, and just, it was a lot easier for me to stay organized and answer those questions. I also found skimming really helpful because my time management was really terrible. I remember on my first SAT QAS, it took me around 90 minutes to finish a reading section, and I needed to skim, so I would spend around 60 seconds reading each passage and just circling all the important things. So this would be like any important grammar, so maybe semicolons, colons, commas, any important words or vocabulary that they would use. So in a science passage, this could be something like the variables, their hypothesis, the objective of the experiment. And in literature passages, this could be like what was really happening in the passage, like what was the meaning of the passage. And for history passage, just like what is their main argument. And then make sure to always learn how to eliminate your answers. So this basically just means like if an answer seems too specific, if it seems too extreme, or there's just topics not referenced in the passage, you can just almost eliminate it immediately. But when you're looking through all the answer choices, just make sure that you're reading all of them word for word, and that you're using like a pen or pencil, and you're just tracing each word as you read it, because this will like help you eliminate any careless mistakes or any misinterpretations of the text. And yeah, always read the answer choices, even if you're like 90% sure that it's wrong, just because sometimes on the SAT it can be very tricky. And if you're unfocused, you could definitely lose sight of the right answer by thinking or reading like one word wrong. And then you want to analyze your mistakes. So for me, I found that my main mistakes were definitely vocabulary in context and evidence-based pairs. And what I did to solve this was basically just do a lot of passages, time yourself, and read strategies on how to overcome those questions. So I went to YouTube. I tried to find a bunch of my strategies, and I went back into the Erica Meltzer book, and I just summarized all of what was in the book, and then every single time I found one of these vocabulary and context questions or evidence-based pair questions, I would, in my brain, summarize all the steps to solving these questions, and then I would just do it step by step. And I made sure to drill that into my brain so that could help me get the answer right. And my last main tip that helped me improve my reading score by 200 points is to really figure out your timing. Learn when to skip questions and when to stay on that question. So, usually, if you're really, really confused about a question, and sometimes this for me was on the science section or the history section, like you didn't understand anything about the question, you read it first glance, you're like, I have no idea how to solve this. Don't waste your time. Just skip it and move on, because there's like a very high probability that you're not going to be able to get this question right, and it's a lot better for you to spend your time on a question that you can probably answer. And so just make sure to like spend only around 45 seconds on each question. Just develop your own pace, and yeah, you just have to keep reminding yourself that there's only 65 minutes on the reading section and that you have to keep going. So if you're trying to double check a question, you have to make sure that it's only around 15 seconds, because if you spend any more time on it, you're most likely going to run out of time at the end and you're not going to be able to answer all the questions. You're going to have to end up guessing. And the last time management tip I really have is try to finish the passages that you're good at first and like leave the passages that you're really bad at to the end. So for me, what I did was I always flipped to the science section first. I finished the first 3 science sections, and then I would do fiction and then history, because I found that science was my strongest type of passage. And then I could usually get around like 95% of those questions right. And then literature, it was really a hit or miss for me. And history, I always got like half the passage wrong. You just want to always flip to the passage you're best at first, because as I said, the SAT, there is very limited time. You want to make sure that you can get as many of the easy questions right first before moving on to the hard questions, because there's a very high probability that you're not going to be able to get that hard questions right anyways. And make sure you're timing yourself for each passage. So for me, I had to spend around 12 minutes on the literature and history passages, but on the science ones, I could probably do like 11 or 10 minutes, depending on how easy it was. And this would leave me with around 5 minutes to bubble. Just really develop your own pace, but always remind yourself that the SAT, you're definitely going to run out of time, and just never stay stuck on one question. It is completely okay to skip. And yeah, just practice a lot. I would definitely recommend doing one SAT a week. Check out the SAT QAS Reddit and do all the Khan Academy ones, and your score will definitely improve. Okay, I'm just gonna answer some fun questions. So Erica Meltzer book isn't worth it.
I had one question for you just on the topic of Erica Meltzer. So I know that you briefly mentioned that you felt that the way that you approached the Erica Meltzer book was wrong. So would you mind just talking about like how you wish you would have approached Erica Meltzer, and like again also just answering the question on if you think the book is worth it?
Okay, so I'm just gonna answer, is it worth it first, and then and then your question, because I feel like that's the most linear way to do it. I definitely think the book is worth it because a lot of the strategies in it are very helpful. And when you like really do the questions and you drill those methods into your brain, it really does help you. So when I finished the Erica Meltzer book, this was about like halfway through July, like summer before grade 11. And the only thing that I really did with the book, I just completed all of the exercise in it, and I would just take SAT practice tests, and I would do like maybe like 1 or 2 passages a day. But the problem was that I wasn't really practicing each strategy. I kind of just read the book and I would just do the passages. Like in my head, how do I say this? Like I was basically passively using the strategies. I was just assuming that that knowledge would all be like incorporated into my brain. Like I would remember everything somehow, and I'd be able to identify each question the way I should have, and just like use the steps. Like, okay, I'm just gonna explain how I would use it because I feel like that would be a lot more helpful than me just like trying to explain why I used it wrongly. I think the proper way to use the Erica Meltzer book is to like grab a full length reading exam and just don't time yourself at all. Just practice identifying every single question as Erica Meltzer like tells you to, like the evidence-based for questions, vocabulary and context, the inference questions, all those things. Just practice identifying them and write down why it's an inference question, why it's this question. And then write down all the steps to solving that question, or like use all those steps when you're doing it until like it's in your brain. Like don't use the book, just read it and do a passage. That's not going to help you. Like you just really have to like practice those steps. Don't do it passively, like try to do it actively, is basically what I'm trying to say. I'm not really sure if that makes sense.
Yes, that did make a lot of sense. So I noticed a question in the chat on how frequently should you use QAS per week?
I only did one a week because I didn't have that much time when school started and I found SAT QASs, but I think the optimal amount you want to do each week is probably like 1 to 2 because you don't want to burn out from doing so many SATs, but you still want to get enough questions that you're definitely improving. I think it definitely depends on the person and like how many SATs you can do without like just completely burning out. And is it possible to go from 1,000 to 1,300 more in 2 months? I definitely think that it is. You probably have to do at least like 2 hours of practice every day, I'd say though. Like just work hard and yeah, you can definitely do it. And just make sure that you're using the resources properly. Like don't be like me. Don't be lazy.
Awesome. Alright, thank you so much, Jenny. I think you shared lots of valuable information about how to strategically approach the reading section. So we will move on now to Trisha, if you could talk about the writing section. I do just want to reiterate again that you all are more than welcome to share in questions in the chat as we go. And if there are certain questions that we may just save for the end, but we will try to answer your questions as they come along. So Trisha, do you want to share reading tips now?
Hi guys. So I'm Trisha. You guys might have seen me before. I have usually done these like panels and stuff, and I really enjoy all of this. First of all, I just wanted to say like everything Jenny said, I fully like agree with her. Honestly, I don't think I could have said it better than that, but that's pretty much exactly what I went through with the Erica Meltzer book. Essentially, I read the book, but then I wasn't able to apply the strategies while I was taking the test. So then once I understood that I wasn't applying the strategies, then I did apply the strategies, and then it definitely worked out for me. So that's something you should keep in mind when you like read SAT like tips and stuff like that. You have to actually be able to apply it for it to work out, not just know it. And moving on to the writing section. So the writing section is usually regarded as the easier section. Like it's not as complicated as the reading section. You can answer a lot of questions just by like the sound of it, if it feels right to you or not. I think the difficult part of the writing section comes in perfection, which is really difficult to achieve, but it's 100% possible and is much easier than the reading section. So my like overall main emphasis would be on like if you're having a lot of trouble with the writing and reading section, then instead of putting every ounce of your energy into the reading section and only improving it a little bit, spread some of that energy into the writing section so you can get it all the way to perfection. How to do that is I also used an Erica Meltzer book. I used her grammar and her reading book, but for the grammar section, she has so much information in that. And it's not only like grammar rules, she has an immense number of practice questions. If you talk about word pairs, she has a big list of common word pairs. If you talk about like conventional English phrases, she has a huge list of that. She has transitions that are organized into positive, negative, contrast, things like that. So that book is so filled with knowledge. The only issue is once you read that book, not a lot of it sticks in your brain. So my biggest advice is when you get like a grammar book or something to learn your grammar rules, you can't read it just once. You have to go over it multiple times. You have to identify things that you remember, things that you don't remember, and drill yourself. Drill yourself until you remember everything. You can't get 100% on the writing section without perfection in your studying as well. And I don't know, I feel like I'm using the word perfection a lot. I don't mean to like stress any of you out, but generally your goal should be to recognize how to solve every type of question, and you have to form the neural pathways in your brain. You have to form those connections in your brains. It's almost like muscle memory. You need to have like SAT muscle memory so that once you find like a type of question, your mind knows immediately how to answer this. And I think that's key. And it obviously comes with practice, But not only that, it also comes with targeting your weaknesses and really improving on those. So for me personally, I used to have a horrible time with transition questions. So you would have two sentences, and in the middle, you have to fill in with a word like, however, for example, in contrast to, you know, to these ends. So my issue was sometimes I didn't know what the transition meant, and sometimes I just didn't know, like, I felt like two answers could be like appropriate transitions. So then I went to the book, I made flashcards of the different transitions, I memorized all of their meanings, and I made it so that any transition I see, I would definitely know what it means and I would know how to apply it in a context. So again, it depends on what your weaknesses are, and you have to put in the effort to drill those weaknesses into your head. This isn't something that anybody else can do for you, it's going to be entirely internal. And as I was saying about like practice, obviously I endorse a lot of practice, but I also would like to emphasize how sometimes spending if you take 3 hours taking the test itself, or imagine your writing section is like 40 something minutes, it's less than an hour. I want you to spend like an hour and a half or something reviewing the test. I want you to spend a lot longer time than what you took taking the test to actually review the test. Once you keep doing that, then you are able to see a lot more clearly the next time when you approach the similar kind of question that you got wrong. And even if you did get a question right, if you are able to trace your steps back, there's not a chance that you would get a similar question wrong in the future. So let's say, for example, if I got a punctuation question correct one time, there's no guarantee I'm going to get it right the other time unless I know the rules for sure. So again, just because you sort of know a topic doesn't mean you should skim over it. I would suggest you still learn every topic so that you're 100% thorough and you would definitely be able to answer those questions. And also regarding reading the passage, I would suggest like lightly skimming it. The title of the passage is extremely important. It gives you the topic, the main idea. And every time the question, usually the writing section doesn't have a question, it just has A, B, C, D. If you do have a question though, make sure you're answering exactly what it tells you to answer. Don't do anything else. Don't assume anything. So those would be my main tips for the writing section. Let me see if there's like any questions. Oh, yeah, I got tagged in the how many SAT QAS per week. I would say do one. I wouldn't recommend doing more than one because you only have a certain amount of, questions to answer. So then you would want to save as much as you can so that you can have fresh practice material all the way up until you can take the test. That was also a really difficult problem for me because I think I used up a lot of the material in the beginning, and then by the time I was taking my second SAT, I didn't have that many tests that I could take. Is College Panda books and Erica Grammar enough for 1450 plus? I would say so. If you're like, if you use those books in the right way, if you actually read them and you learn everything in it, so not just a single read through, I'm saying like reading it multiple times, taking notes and memorizing. If you do that, 1450 plus is definitely achievable. Yeah. So I think that would be it for me. And if you have any more questions, feel free to ping me in the chat and then ask me.
So much, Trisha. You shared lots of great information about the writing section. I especially like the way you said about reviewing your answers. I think this applies to any section, but it is much more valuable if you do just 10 questions, but review all of those 10 questions, than if you do 20 questions and then just don't look at them again. And so I think that's really important advice that is applicable for all sections. So lastly, I'll turn it over to Mihael to talk about the math section of the SAT and also the ACT if you're comfortable, since I think that you would be able to cover on some of the differences in the math sections between the SAT and ACT.
The SAT and ACT math sections, they have some similarities and some differences. So I think we went over earlier like the timing and the number of questions. Just to kind of refresh you guys on that, the SAT math section has 60 questions in 60 minutes. They're all multiple choice, And in my opinion, they go a little bit deeper into some more difficult topics than the SAT does. For the SAT, it's actually divided into two sections, with and without calculator. Both of those give you more than 1 minute per question, so you kind of have a more generous like time limit than you do in the ACT. And then, from my experience, those questions don't necessarily cover as difficult problems, but they make the problems more complex rather than inherently difficult. So I have a couple examples of problems that I just want to show you how I'd approach them. If I can find them. And, okay. You'll kind of see what I mean in that the specific topic, I think we're asked to find both X and Y. So the topic itself is actually not too difficult. The exact tool that you'll use to answer this can be found at the front of the SAT booklet. They give you a few formulas that'll be really useful. They give you some special triangles. They give you the equations for like a 30, 60, 90 triangle, and things like that. But what makes this difficult is that the actual problem is kind of embedded into a more difficult scenario. So you see this big square, you see a bunch of lines and a few numbers. That looks pretty complicated. But once you break it down, you can see that the middle triangle is 30, 60, 90. The top left triangle is 30, 60, 90, and so is the bottom right. So if you notice that and apply those formulas correctly and keep track of your variables, you will get the right answer. It's just a little bit complicated rather than being difficult. You're not going to see any calculus, no limits, no derivatives, nothing like that on the SAT. You will see some relatively, oh yeah, good question. What is the actual question? I'm pretty sure this wanted you to solve for X. I don't remember for certain, but I'm pretty sure that's what they wanted us to find. X and Y. Yeah, so we could find X or Y or both. And yeah, I'll go ahead and kind of walk you through that. Or maybe the area of the leftover. But, well, whatever it is, we can still use similar triangles to find it. I'm actually not going to go too in-depth to the whole question because we have a little bit more to cover, but that's kind of the type of question you might expect to see. Now, as for the ACT, I've seen things like trigonometry, I've seen complex numbers, and some like objectively more complicated topics than that. And I've also seen that the time limit is a little bit more rigid because you have 1 minute per question, as opposed to having a total of like 78 minutes for 58 questions on the SAT. So I would say that in general, the ACT is a more like math and science based class. So if you're trying to decide whether to take the SAT or ACT, I would think about your strong suits. We heard some tips about the science section on the ACT earlier. In my opinion, the science section and the fact that the ACT goes into somewhat more complicated math makes the ACT a better choice if you're more into the STEM fields. Whereas the ACT is something that I would recommend if you enjoy reading more, because there's more of a focus on reading in the SAT. So, but don't take my word for it, because I think I always advise people to practice as much as they can on their own and see what they like best. You may interpret it a little bit differently than me, but that's just from my experience what I've found with SAT and ACT math. I'll show you another question that, in my opinion, is one of the harder ones we've seen in this server, because, here we go. Because it's just really hard to visualize. Like, that's just the truth. It's a difficult problem to visualize. And the way that I always approach these math questions is I try to visualize them, I try to write an equation, I try to make them make sense in simpler terms than how they're asked. So looking at the last question, if they want us to solve for x, really all they should do is give us one triangle and say 5, and say we have a side of 5, we have a 30-degree angle, find x. But instead, they take a more difficult, they take a simpler concept and they make it nested inside of a tough question. As for this one, I think it's actually a pretty difficult question if you don't have experience in this type of thing. It's honestly the kind of thing I'd expect to see on competition math rather than on like a standardized test. But for this question, the difficulty is visualizing it. And I think my best advice to people is that for people taking this kind of question is just do more of these questions in practice. Isolate the ones that are considered harder if these are the types that you're struggling on, and just keep doing them. Yeah, I see some reactions saying 52. That I believe that is the answer I got for this. But yeah, so you'll see plenty of different types of questions, and I don't have any examples from the ACT, but yeah, the ACT has somewhat more difficult concepts. You'll see some complex numbers. You'll see some trig a little bit, not too much, but still you'll see some. Whereas the SAT really goes into algebra and geometry and some problem solving, trying to trick you rather than make the questions inherent. I can take some questions. I don't think I have anything else for you guys, but if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them about the math sections.
Awesome. So we did have one question about A levels. So to an unknown user, I'm not exactly sure what the A level syllabus is. So if you could have a syllabus that you can share about the topics that are covered, that would be awesome. But Mihael, if you want to talk about like what particular topics in math someone should know to be prepared for the SAT and ACT.
Okay, yeah. So for the SAT, for the SAT, I would definitely what helped me the most was geometry and algebra classes that I'd had. So I would say basically like all of the special triangle formulas would be important to know and be familiar with. You know, Pythagorean theorem, 30, 60, 90 triangles, and things like that. Um, let's see. There are some the angles within a circle as well. So basically, the sorts of things that you get in a high school or even eighth grade, middle school type geometry class. And also, there's a good bit of algebra. So one of the things that pops up the most, even if it's like part of a more complicated question, is factoring the quadratic formula and things like that. So I don't know too much about the specifics of O level and A levels, but if you have like a complete geometry and algebra class, those are the sorts that I think are most important for SAT. For ACT, oh, that's a great list. Yeah, algebra, quadratic functions, some problem solving, and geometry. Yeah, those are great. So ACT, there are just a couple things that I go a little bit more in depth with that I haven't seen on the SAT. Complex numbers, you'll have to like add, subtract, and multiply them sometimes. And what else? Oh, and a little bit more advanced trig. I feel like you'll have more of like the sine, cosine, tangent type problems on the ACT than the SAT. But in general, I would just focus on the topics that you learn in most algebra and geometry classes and make sure you know them well and have those tools at your disposal. And then at that point, when you see the question, it's just a matter of if you recognize which tool you're supposed to use.
Awesome. All right. So I think that's it for the questions that we've had for math so far. If you guys have any other questions that you have about math or any of the sections, feel free to share them because we're actually now going to move on to just general questions. So I'm going to start off by asking just a few questions for the panelists of my own, just to ask you guys about your journey. And then from here, we're going to move on to registration questions as well as answering any additional questions that you all share in the chat. So first, I just wanted to ask our panelists, and any of you are free to answer any of these questions. But first, I just wanted to ask, did you take the SAT, ACT, or both? And how did you choose which tests to take?
Okay, I can answer this question first, if that's okay. I only took the SAT. I I didn't even consider taking the ACT because I'm Canadian and a lot of the topics on the ACT math section were not actually covered by my math teachers, and I just thought it'd be a huge waste of time for me to go and learn those ACT math topics that I would never use in life. Like the SAT was just a lot easier for me because I actually knew the content on it. The only hard part was the reading. But yeah.
Thanks for that. Michael, do you want to talk about why you chose to take both?
Sure. So my story is actually a little bit different because I was in the Duke Tip program in middle school, and what they did was they actually let me like take kind of some simplified versions of the SAT and ACT. I think it was seventh grade or something that I got some exposure to both. Um, and from there, I got okay scores on them because I was in seventh grade, um, but from there, I realized like I kind of learned some of the differences between them both. And when it was time to start taking them, I immediately went for the SAT because in my high school they had us all take the PSAT, so it kind of just followed naturally. I think I took my first SAT sophomore or junior year, and then at that point, I got a decent score. I decided to take it again, improve my score by a few points. Um, but then at that point, my school actually offered either an SAT or ACT, like paid for by the school. And at that point, I decided, oh, I've already taken the SAT. I'll take the ACT at school. And that's kind of how I ended up taking both. I think I probably would have ended up taking both anyway. And honestly, that is like, if you're not sure which one is better for you, there's no harm to taking them both. But um, I would say if you're making the decision, if you don't have much time left, or if you don't want to sit through that many tests, I would advise you to take a few practice tests of both and kind of just know your strengths and your weaknesses. If you're not really into the math and science sections, go for the SAT. If you're very STEM focused, go for the ACT. And if you're pretty good at both, then there's really no harm to taking both, as long as you're familiar with the topics and think you can get decent scores. That's not to say, like, if you don't know the topics, take them both for the sake of taking them both, but I would say do a little practice of both tests, see which ones fit your skill sets. And for me, because I was like pretty good at both of them, I ended up taking both. So let's see, Boulder saying universities accept the SAT. I don't know. From my experience, I've heard they both accept both tests. I've never seen one that only accepts the SAT, but maybe different universities are different. Um, yeah, I think they both accept both test scores. I don't think most universities really differentiate between them. Um, so yeah, I would take whichever one matches your strengths best, and when in doubt, there's no harm in taking both.
Yep. Alright, so I think both of you shared very different perspectives that give insight. I think a couple of things just to summarize. If you are on the verge between SAT and ACT, which should do both, either one or the other, I think that you should take a practice test for both. As Mihael said, taking a practice test of both, seeing which one you're more comfortable with, because it could very well be that like you're maybe strong at all the different topics. I'm sorry about the ringer, by the way, but you could be strong at the topics covered. But for me, it came down to pacing. I personally enjoyed the SAT pacing a lot more just because I had more time per question, more time to really look back, check on my answers. I had enough time to at the end of each section to check my work. So I prefer the SAT more strictly because of timing, but the rationale will be different for all of you. So I really encourage you, if you're on the verge of deciding between both, to take a practice test. That being said, if you're on a time crunch, as Jenny mentioned, there may be one test that you're just more comfortable with. If you're really good at STEM, it may be ACT. If you just haven't had as much exposure to the math, it may be SAT. So if you're on a time crunch, if you have limited time, I would strongly encourage you to just stick with one and know it really well than to waste your time spreading yourself too thin over 2 tests and not maximizing your score. So the next question I want to ask is, which resources did you use to supplement your questions? We had one person ask for resources that are beyond books and tutors, but if you want to talk about general resources you've used, whether it be books, websites, other resources beyond that helped you. Trisha, do you want to answer the question?
Yeah, sure. So I used the Erica Meltzer grammar and the Erica Meltzer reading book. And then for math, I only had like a couple topics like in statistics and like ratios or something like that I need to touch up on. So I used Khan Academy for that. And then aside from that, the Reddit was really helpful for me. I used the QAS test that I found there. And then what else did I use? I used a lot of Prep Scholar blogs where, he talks about the methods he used to get to those perfect scores. So then I tried to emulate that into my own studying. Yep.
Awesome, thanks. Mihael, Jenny, do you both want to add anything to this question?
Sure. I'm just gonna rank my resources in terms of like how much I'd recommend them. So the resources that I would really recommend, like you have to use them because they were so helpful. Definitely College Pounder writing and math, or the Erica Meltzer's one. The Erica Meltzer grammar. I think they're both like really, really helpful. That improved my writing score so much. And then College Pounder math. And the SAT QAS, you also have to do like the QAS. I think it's a really realistic version of the actual SAT compared to the Khan Academy test. And then YouTube. YouTube is actually really helpful if you find the right teachers. Like, don't use accounts with probably like 10 subscribers or something with like really bad video quality. You're probably not going to get what you're looking for. But if you find like a YouTube channel with like maybe a few thousand subscribers, you watch the video for like 20 minutes, you're like, yes, this is helping me, then YouTube is probably going to help you. I also used this really terrible math book. I think it was like 21 lessons to get an 800. I thought it was good because Prep Scholar, but I did that math book for like 2 months, and I just found that the questions were just unnecessarily hard, and I don't think they helped me at all for the actual SAT. I think I just wasted my money. Like, Khan Academy is a lot better, and yeah, you just have to use Khan Academy because there's resources and everything for the SAT. So I'm just gonna write this down in the chat, which resources are really good and which ones are just terrible.
Awesome. Alright, so I'm going to, before I move on to another question, I remember, let me see, oh no, wait, I think you left. Okay, never mind. So the next question that I see from registration is, where can we get practice material that resembles SAT questions beside past SAT exams? So I think I'll just answer this quickly, and then if any panelists want to add on, feel free to do so. The best resource to get questions that resemble the SAT are from College Board themselves, which includes Khan Academy, SAT practice tests, and SAT QAS. Aside from those, there are other companies that do produce exams that resemble the SAT, but they're not as authentic since they're not by the College Board themselves. So Kaplan, Princeton Review, I'm pretty sure there are other companies as well that produce their own practice tests. So if you find yourself like completely running out of practice tests to use, then sure, go ahead and use those. But the best resource you can use is exams from College Board themselves. Barron is a lot more difficult than the actual SAT. I wouldn't recommend Barron if you're looking for something realistic, similar to the SAT. So the next question I see here, also I just want to reiterate that if any of you have additional questions that are in your own head, like feel free to share them in the chat and we'll answer them. Right now I'm just going through questions that are asked in registration. So I see one question in the chat about some of the math topics on the ACT are in the 12th grade curriculum, which you haven't learned yet, so should I take the SAT? I personally think that you probably may benefit from just taking the SAT. I would encourage you to take a practice test for both and seeing how difficult the concepts are for the ACT. If you find yourself to be a quick learner, then it may not be as big of a difference. Like, you may be able to pick the topics up on your own quickly if you are just a fast learner. But you should take a practice test to see overall. If you really enjoyed the ACT and it's just a matter of a few topics, then you can learn it on your own. But you most likely will be more comfortable with the SAT, since the SAT only goes up to very simple pre-calc. So, another question from registration is, did you find it helpful to have a study group, or did you study individually? Would anyone like, Mihael, do you want to answer this about if you prefer study groups or studying individually for the SAT and ACT?
Yeah, sure. So I didn't really do study groups, but I feel like a good comparison is probably like the way that people ask questions, even just in this server, and get feedback from a few people. Sometimes I even see somebody ask a question and then help someone else out that with their own question. So I feel like some of the things that have happened, even just in the server's channels, are really beneficial in the ways that a study group would be. Even if you don't have like, well, even if like your friends don't want to study with you, like you can always come to a server like this, and we have a really healthy community of people who will always be up to help you out. So I think that's really advantageous. But in the end, it will come down to how well you do on your practice test. You know, how well you do when you put your computer away, put everything away except pencil, paper, and calculator, and just sit down and do a practice test. I think that's like the best predictor of how you're going to do. So I think individual and group both good. I don't really have like a preference as to which one's better, because I think they help you in different ways. Like studying individually will help you with the timing and figuring out your strengths and weaknesses, whereas if you really have no idea on a question, it's always a good idea to just ask someone. Maybe they'll be able to share a different perspective on how they would solve it that you hadn't thought of yet. Um, so I would say both of them have their different advantages.
Thank you. So the next question I see in the chat, I'm going to ask Trisha to answer this one. So how should we properly or actively review the questions that we get wrong? And I also just want to add on to this question, review the questions that you got right as well, since I think you should be reviewing both the questions you got wrong or right. So Trisha, how would you approach reviewing your questions?
Alright, so something that I did was I identified like what topic it was in. So this was in reading. I identified if it was a main idea kind of question, or if it was like a purpose question, vocabulary question, or if it was in writing, I would identify it was conventional English, or punctuation, or possessive pronouns, apostrophes, modifiers. There's going to be a lot of topics that the SAT like tests you on. So first I identify which topic it is. And I personally like to keep like a tally of which ones I got wrong. But if I don't do that, then what I do is I go over, especially for the writing, I think I drilled myself really hard for that one. I go over every question and then I retrace my steps once again. I think, okay, if I were to get this question again, would I have given the same answer? Or which answer would I have given if I saw this question again? So then I would like think back to what I was thinking. It's all in like what I think during the test. So then I obviously just retrace my steps, and then if I did get it wrong, I retrace my steps, I read the book, and then I identify how I'm supposed to approach it the next time. And then ideally, you would want to go into like Khan Academy or something, find that topic. Usually they have like questions by topic, and they give you like a small like 5-question set. So then I just do like 5 questions of the topic that I got wrong or something like that until I'm comfortable with it, and hopefully by the next time I would not make that same mistake. So it all comes down to identifying your mistake, retracing your thoughts, either retaining it, like, you know, telling yourself to keep thinking that way, or changing how you want to think by using the book, and then actually changing how you think by drilling a bunch of questions of the same topic. That's what I would suggest.
Thank you, Trisha. So the next question I have from the chat is about Khan Academy. So what are the benefits of Khan Academy's SAT prep besides the practice tests that are offered? So Jenny, do you mind answering this question?
Sure. Is it okay if I just talk about the previous question first?
Oh yeah, sure.
The how to review questions.
Yeah.
So basically what Trisha said, but I just want to talk about what I do differently for the math and reading sections. So reading section, basically exactly what Trisha said. So identify the topic, identify why you got it wrong, and then think about what you could have done differently for next time, and write down the steps from Erica Meltzer or I don't know, College Panda on how to properly do the question for reading. For math, I made a lot of careless mistakes in math. So sometimes for math, I wouldn't really identify the topic. Sometimes I'd be I know this, but the reason I got it wrong was a careless mistake. So I wouldn't actually write down the steps to how to solve maybe a complex number question. Instead, I would reflect on what I could do to get rid of that careless mistake. And for math, if you identify the topic and you're just I have no idea, I don't understand this concept at all, you can't just write down the steps to solving the question. What you have to do is you have to go on YouTube or go on Khan Academy or College Panda or whatever resource it is, and you have to read the topic. You have to actually understand the topic before you can actually get that question right on another practice test. So basically what I'm trying to say is on math, you really have to identify why you're getting it wrong. It could be careless mistake, understanding issue, or you just really screwed up one step on solving the question. And there's just a different approach to all of them. Whereas reading, I feel it's just more of a singular approach, at least for me. And the benefits, what are the benefits of Khan Academy's SAT prep besides the 10 practice tests by the College Board? I definitely think that the math section, all those questions are really good. They are very realistic. They just look a lot like the actual SAT. And then the reading questions, they're also very realistic. So all of it is just a really good resource which provides actual questions which would be in the SAT, and it provides it in a really simple format, and it helps you reflect on all the resources. Every time you get a question wrong, it will tell you why. I think it's just a really convenient way to study. I don't really know. I can't really summarize advantages or whatever.
Thank you, Jenny. And I think just adding on to that, Khan Academy is just so nice because they also give you a breakdown of all the different skills. So it's in addition to the practice test, you have the different types of questions broken down and practice questions for each of those types of questions. So it's really nice for when you're supplementing those strategies into actual practice problems, you have the Khan Academy questions to practice those skills on, and they're literally directly from the College Board. So it's the most authentic question examples that you can get. So I do just want to talk about time. So we do have roughly 10 more minutes for the session. So I do just want to have a last call for any questions that you all have. So if you all have any final questions, keep them coming. So let's see. Is writing a reminder for the mistakes? Sorry, I kicked myself off the call. But is writing a reminder for the mistakes you make in the practice test in your Google Doc and then looking back at that before another test a good idea for reviewing? Do any of you want to answer this question?
I did that actually. I wrote down my mistakes in the doc, and then I always wrote down why I got it wrong, and then the skill I have to remember. So if I forgot that there was actually a full sentence before, so I was allowed to use a colon or something like that, I would write that down. And then I think the day before the exam or before I take an exam, I just to review everything. It's not something super serious, but it was just something so that, I just had a refresher.
Awesome. And yeah, I think that keeping track of your mistakes and reviewing them is really important as well. So another question I see from the chat is, if I'm really good at math and not so good in reading and writing, unless I do a lot of practice, which test is better for me? So, do any of you want to answer this? I do just want to quickly say myself that regardless of the answer, you should do practice. If you don't do practice, you're not going to get the score you want, and that's just what it is. But aside from this, do any of you want to chime in on which test you think would be better for them? Mihael, what are your thoughts?
This about like the SAT versus ACT, like which is better?
Yeah, so the person mentioned that they're good at math, but not as good as reading and writing. So, which test do you think would be better?
I mean, my instinct would say the ACT is probably what I'd recommend, because I definitely found the math to be a little bit more difficult and the reading, writing to be a little easier on the ACT. So if math and even if science are like your strong suits, I would recommend starting with the ACT, and just see how you do in a few practice tests for the ACT. And I mean, there's definitely no harm to doing some practice tests for the SAT as well, but I would guess that you'd do better on the ACT than the SAT if you're good at math but not so good at reading and writing.
I agree with that. Thank you. So, I also do just want to...
Can I talk about it too?
Yeah. Go ahead. I was going to add on to you, but yeah, go ahead.
I was just wanted to add on like something small. I don't like full. There's like two sides to this. So while the English is easier in the ACT, I like to look at it in terms of how much of your score is math or English. So the reason I chose to do the SAT is because I knew half of my score would be my math score, and in the ACT, half of my score, I mean, only a fourth of my score is my math score. And since like I was stronger at the math section, I thought that taking the SAT was a smarter decision for me. So instead of just looking at like your strengths and weaknesses, I also like to look at like how much of your score is comprised of these sections.
I just want to add on to that because, like, for me, I was in a similar situation where it's like I am stronger at math than I am for reading and writing, but I ended up taking the SAT because I felt the pacing was really important for me. For the ACT, the questions are more direct, but for me at least, you only really have time to just answer the questions once and not look back, which I found to be a little problematic because, like, I really preferred having time to review my questions, go back to them, really make sure that I agreed with the answer choices that I selected the first time I went around, especially because sometimes in the time crunch mistakes happen. So for me personally, I ended up taking the SAT even though I was better at math because I enjoyed the pacing better. By taking the SAT, I would have like at least half the time, if not more, left to check my work, which helped me really feel confident that I was maximizing the points for the math section as well as for the reading and writing. I had enough time to check my work. So I do just want to say that ultimately the ACT may be the one that you want to start off with first, but you should take practice tests for both and evaluate like that. Turtle, I see that you're unmuted. Do you have a question? Okay, if not, I will ask you to mute yourself. So the next question that I see, I'm gonna take maybe one or two more questions from the chat and then we'll end it off. So I see one question about if I have no time left, if I'm like running, if I have just a few minutes left and I have a couple of questions left, like what strategy should I use for guessing? Jenny, do you want to talk about this? I know you kind of just answered it, but...
Sure. So I would just eliminate questions based off like, is it too specific, too extreme, who was this reference? And then if there's like two options left, I would personally just trust my gut feeling because you don't really have time, just eliminate and move on.
Great. And yeah, I think just adding on to Jenny, words such as like always, never, extreme words like that, those are really big red flags. Oh, words that include answer choices that include extremes are almost always wrong. I'm putting it almost just because, I don't want to say an extreme. But yeah, so just if you're at that time crunch, sometimes it's helpful to have a letter of the day, which is basically like one answer choice letter that you stick to, if for any questions that you haven't got right, just because every answer choice has an equal chance. You'll have like, after you take the SAT and after you finish it, roughly 25% of A's will be right, 25% of B's will be right, 25% of C's will be right, blah, blah, blah. So having one letter kind of increases your chances of getting the certain number of questions right. But so if you absolutely have no clue at all, you can have that one letter that you just resort to for every question that you don't get to. But aside from that, just being strategic about like extreme words or your gut feeling, as Jenny said, is great. So I'm just going to ask one final question, and that's if each of our panelists could share any final pieces of advice that you want to share before we end the session.
I don't know. Just stay consistent, practice, and don't burn out, really. I think everything else I've wanted to say, I've already said.
Awesome. What about Mihael and Trisha?
My main advice is to just spend more time reviewing than actually practicing SAT questions.
Yeah, my advice would be know your strengths and weaknesses, be confident in your strengths, work on your weaknesses, and just do the best you can. You're not all going to get a 1600. I don't think even any of the panelists got like a 1600. That's just really hard. But do the best that you can with what you have, and yeah, just be confident in your strengths and weaknesses.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, first of all, to our panelists for sharing lots of great insight during the session. I hope that the information that we shared throughout the session was helpful for you all to help you just get a better understanding of the SAT and ACT strategies that you can use to approach the different sections and answering some common questions that you all asked about just navigating the SAT and ACT. So we will be having future events as well, continuing on the different sections of college admissions, so definitely stay on the lookout. And if you have any future feedback or events that you'd like to see or any things that you want to share, definitely feel free to let me know. So with that, this is the end of our SAT and ACT panel. So thank you so much everyone for attending, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys in our future events.